Hello, welcome to part 2. Okay, so we've just looked at the powers held by the states, and what I forgot to mention, or I didn't get around to, was the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, which states very clearly the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively. In other words, any power we've forgotten to give to the federal government, assume that's a power which the states have. So again, that's one of those very vague, wishy-washy kind of phrases. It's in the Amendment 10, which basically says that anything which isn't kind of nailed down for the federal government, assume it's a power held by the states. Now, a number of powers held by the states are also held by the government in Washington, D.C., and these are kind of shared powers, often, technically known as concurrent powers. Okay, and these include things like, let me just change the thing, raising taxation. So we said before that the states have the power to raise taxation or lower taxation within their states. However, the federal government also raises taxation. So if you're an American citizen, let's say you live in, North Carolina, you would pay taxes which are set by North Carolina government, and you'd also pay national federal taxes as well. So there are national taxes and the state taxes. Okay, that's the first thing to get your head around. States and the federal government can borrow money as well. Okay. They both have the power to spend money on welfare of the people, because as we said before, the states have the power and the authority for the morals, welfare and morals of the people. Well, actually the federal government also has responsibility for welfare as well, because one of the powers given to Congress is about welfare of citizens. So again, they're both responsible, if you like, for welfare of citizens. And they both can pass laws. So the federal government in Washington passes lots of laws. Each individual state passes lots of laws. And they're both responsible for enforcing those laws. So you often get in most states, in all states, you get local police who are run by the state and controlled by the state legislatures, the LAPD or whatever. But you also get the federal bureaucracies as well. So you have like the FBI, for example. So they're both responsible for enforcing laws within the states, and they've got to make sure federal laws are being enacted, as are state laws. Now, some powers are held or reserved for the federal government only. Okay, so these include the enumerated powers given to the federal institutions. So all the powers in the Constitution, which says the President shall be Commander-in-Chief and the Congress has this power, and this power, those are the enumerated powers held by the federal government. So they're not shared, they are federally government controlled, if you like. All foreign affairs and defence are dealt with by the federal government, so you can't have Iowa making an independent treaty with Mexico or something like that. So all these things have to be done at a federal level by the national government. The Constitution states that Congress is responsible for, quote, to regulate commerce with foreign nations, so doing treaties with foreign powers, among the several states. So Congress is responsible for regulating trade between, say, Iowa and New Hampshire, or between California and New York State or something like that, and also with the Indian tribes as well. So Congress has those powers, and this clause is often known as the Commerce Clause, because it's dealing with commerce and trade. So that's part of Congress's job. So what I suppose that really means is that Iowa can't have a special trade agreement, if you like, with a neighbouring state. This is because that would then lead to all sorts of problems, wouldn't it? You need to have an internal market within the United States. Hence why Congress is responsible for it. And then this is an interesting one. This is in what I call the odds and sods section, Amendment 6, Section 2. It's called the Supremacy Clause. And what it means in practice is that the federal government always wins in disputes over the states. So, for example, if there was a federal law which contradicted a state law, then the federal law would win. Now, these things have to fit into the Constitution. So if you actually read what this clause says, the Supremacy Clause, it says, trying to find it, Article Section 2, here it is. It says, this Constitution and the law of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made, under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state or the country notwithstanding. So the Constitution and the laws of the United States are supreme, essentially. Okay? If any law is passed by any state which contradicts the Constitution, it can be deemed unconstitutional, and it could go to the Supreme Court or one of the lower courts. So the Supremacy Clause is a really significant clause in the Constitution. It's kind of buried away right near the end. Now, the federal government has grown since this is where you get conflict over the federalism and the federal government. Because originally, they often called it layer cake federalism. So in other words, there are particular powers held by the federal government in like a layer, like the jam bit, if you like, in a cake. And then the states had the most power, well, they're quite clearly defined. There wasn't much overlap between the two. What has happened over time, though, is that the federal government, the government in Washington, D.C., has gradually, arguably, increased its powers at the expense of the individual states. And this is what gets conservatives in particular very upset. When they talk about state rights and things, what they're referring to is that the federal government in Washington has, by various devious and nasty means, increased its powers against the individual states. And there's been a number of reasons why this has happened. One of them is all the loopholes in the Constitution, all the wishy-washy phrases, things like, the elastic clause, things like, the Common Defence and General Welfare Clause, which Congress has. That enabled Congress to then interfere in states over welfare, for example, which, as we've seen before, is also a power which the states have. So in other words, it's allowed it to exploit that concurrent power for its own benefit. The Commerce Clause, who we just mentioned before about regulating trade between the several states, again, it's allowed the federal government, if you like, to kind of stick its beak into state affairs regarding commerce. Some of the amendments have also had a big impact on the growth of the federal government. The 14th Amendment, for example, which is going back to the days of the Civil War, these amendments were made basically, to end the Civil War and kind of do the settlement that came afterwards. So the 14th Amendment says very clearly, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. So no law can be made by a state which kind of takes away any privileges of US citizens, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. So this is often called the Due Process Amendment or the Equal Protection Amendment. So it was originally done to try about freeing the slaves, because obviously slavery goes against all those sorts of things. But critics say it's been added to by the federal government since. They've used the due process to try and increase the role of the federal government, because, why should some states deny same-sex marriage, for example, and other states not? Is that not the states depriving some groups of people the privileges of being a citizen of the United States? So the Due Process Amendment has been quite significant, some have argued, for extending the power of the federal government. The 16th Amendment allowed the federal government to impose income tax. It was actually not in the Constitution before that. And interesting, what happened was the Supreme Court, the Congress passed a law to impose income tax across the entire United States. as a federal tax. It went to the Supreme Court, who said it was unconstitutional. Who said it was constitutional, sorry. No, said it was unconstitutional. Then what happened was there was a constitutional amendment, which is the 16th Amendment, which specifically says that Congress and the federal government can introduce a national income tax. I think it's inconceivable today that an amendment would ever go through to actually raise taxation. But anyway, so again, that is seen as the federal government increasing its role, because now it's increasing the amount of taxes it can get from US citizens. Other ways and means by which the federal government has grown is through crises. So an argument is that whenever there's some kind of crisis, the federal government normally steps in and then doesn't give back any of the powers it has gained. So, for example, in the 1930s, when the Wall Street crashed, when the economy went belly up, the states were unable, there were that many people unemployed, and you had these shanty towns developed around American cities, often called Hoovervilles. Many states just could not afford welfare of their citizens. They could not do their constitutional duty of providing for the welfare of their citizens, because they're getting less taxes coming in because everyone was unemployed. They were then also having to try and raise money to try and deal with this. And so they asked the federal government for assistance. FDR's government was more than willing to assist. But since that date, the federal government has always taken a big role in terms of providing for welfare of citizens. So that's an example of a crisis leading to the states asking the federal government for help, and then the federal government not giving those powers back to the states. So the federal government dominates the relationship in terms of welfare, which again upsets some conservatives in particular. And then also, of course, America itself has become a great power. And again, this has enhanced the federal government, so that the presidency and stuff has been enhanced by things like the Cold War and the post-Cold War. You know, the commander-in-chief role of the president has really become a really important kind of figure. The president himself has become a really important figurehead in terms of national politics, far greater than perhaps it was in the 19th century, for example. So again, this has just enhanced, if you like, the reputation and role of the federal government. Now, I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to do a part 3 to this video. So watch out for part 3 in a couple of minutes.